The Cry in the Grass. Opening hook, 100 words. The Dakota sun hung merciless and white when Caleb Ross heard the sound that would shatter his solitary life. A baby's cry, thin as wire, cutting through the endless grass. He found them 20 yards off the trail. A young woman collapsed in the dirt, her lips cracked and bleeding, an infant writhing against her chest with a hunger that had gone beyond tears into silence. No wagon, no horse, no water, just a mother and child left to die under a sky that didn't care. Caleb had two choices: ride on and stay free, or step into a storm he couldn't see coming. If you're ready for a story of courage, redemption, and a family forged in fire, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment with your city so I can see how far this story travels. Now, let's begin. Caleb Ross had been riding alone for 3 years, and that was exactly how he preferred it. The Dakota Territory stretched before him in waves of golden grass and wind-scrubbed sky, endless and indifferent. His horse, a gray gelding named Ash, moved with the steady rhythm of an animal that knew its rider asked for nothing but distance. Caleb's saddlebags carried jerky, hardtack, coffee, and a bedroll. His rifle rested across his lap. His past rode silent behind him, and he intended to keep it there. He'd left Missouri after the war, not running exactly, but not staying either. There were men who came home and picked up where they'd left off, married their sweethearts, worked their father's land, rebuilt what had burned. Caleb wasn't one of them. The things he'd seen, the things he'd done, they didn't wash off. So he drifted west, taking work where he found it, never lingering long enough for anyone to ask questions or expect answers. The sun was brutal that afternoon, the kind of heat that made the horizon shimmer and turned sweat to salt before it could cool you. Caleb pulled his hat lower and kept moving, eyes scanning the land out of habit more than concern. This wasn't raiding country, it was empty country, the kind of place where a man could ride for days without seeing another soul. That's when he heard it. At first he thought it was a bird, some high, keening cry carried on the wind. But it didn't stop. It rose and fell, desperate and rhythmic, and it didn't belong to anything with wings. Caleb reined Ash to a halt, listening. The cry came again, fainter now, almost lost beneath the rush of wind through the grass. A baby. His jaw tightened. Out here, that sound meant only one thing: someone was in trouble. He turned Ash toward the noise and urged him forward, scanning the prairie. The grass stood waist-high in places, swaying in golden waves that could hide 100 things. He rode slowly, ears straining, until he saw it. A patch of disturbed earth, flattened grass, and a dark shape lying motionless in the dirt. Caleb dismounted before Ash had fully stopped. The woman lay on her side, one arm curled protectively around a bundle wrapped in faded calico. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her face streaked with dust and dried blood. Her lips were cracked, her skin burned raw by the sun. She wasn't moving. The baby in her arms was. The infant's face was red and contorted, mouth open in a silent scream that barely had breath behind it. The tiny fist jerked weakly, and the eyes, blue and unfocused, rolled with exhaustion. Caleb dropped to his knees beside them, his hands moving on instinct. He pressed 2 fingers to the woman's throat. Her pulse was there, thin, erratic, but there. He shifted to the baby, carefully lifting the small body from the woman's limp grasp. The child was light, too light, and the diaper beneath the wrapping was bone dry. Dehydration. Starvation. Maybe heat stroke. He glanced around, searching for any sign of a wagon, a horse, supplies, anything that would explain how a woman and infant had ended up alone in the middle of nowhere. There was nothing. Just trampled grass and the faint impressions of boot prints leading east before they disappeared into the wind-scrubbed earth. Someone had left them here, on purpose. Caleb's hand stilled for a moment, his mind working through the implications. Then the baby made a weak, gasping sound, and he shoved the thoughts aside. He pulled his canteen from his belt, uncapped it, and wet his fingers. He touched them gently to the baby's lips, letting a few drops of water slide into the tiny mouth. The infant's tongue moved reflexively, and a faint whimper followed. Caleb repeated the motion, slow and careful, watching the small throat work to swallow. "Easy," he murmured. "Easy now." He turned back to the woman, tilted her head carefully, and dripped water onto her cracked lips. She didn't wake, but her throat moved, and that was something. Caleb sat back on his heels, staring at the two of them. He had maybe half a canteen left. No milk, no shelter. The nearest town was Ridgefield, 15 miles south, and the sun was already starting its descent. If he rode hard, he could make it by nightfall, but not with a woman who couldn't sit a horse and a baby who couldn't hold its own head up. He looked at Ash, then at the vast, empty prairie around them. There was no choice. There had never been a choice. He shrugged out of his coat, wrapped the baby tightly inside it, and tucked the bundle against his chest. Then he slid his arms beneath the woman, lifting her as carefully as he could. She was dead weight, her head lolling against his shoulder. He carried her to Ash, who stood patient and still, as if he understood the gravity of the moment. Getting them both onto the horse was awkward and precarious. Caleb settled the woman across the saddle first, then climbed up behind her, holding her upright with one arm while cradling the baby against his ribs with the other. Ash shifted beneath the uneven load but didn't protest. "Let's go," Caleb said quietly, and the gelding moved. The ride to Ridgefield was the longest 15 miles Caleb had ever traveled. The woman drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring broken words he couldn't make sense of. The baby alternated between thin, exhausted cries and a silence that worried him more. He stopped twice to give them water, rationing the canteen carefully, and each time he wondered if they'd make it. The sun was a red smear on the horizon when the first buildings of Ridgefield came into view. It wasn't much of a town. A main street lined with storefronts, a church, a saloon, a livery stable, and a scattering of houses. But it had a doctor, and that was all Caleb cared about. He rode straight to the center of town, where a painted sign marked the physician's office. People stopped to stare as he passed, women in aprons, men in shirt sleeves, children kicking dust in the street. Caleb ignored them all. He pulled Ash to a halt outside the doctor's office and dismounted, still holding the woman and child. The door opened before he could knock, and a man in his 50s with wire-rimmed spectacles and shirt sleeves stepped out. "Good God," the doctor said, eyes widening. "What happened?" "Found them in the grass," Caleb said shortly. "About 15 miles north. No water, no supplies. The woman's unconscious. The baby's starving." The doctor didn't waste time with questions. He gestured Caleb inside, leading him to a small examination room with a narrow bed and a table cluttered with instruments and bottles. Caleb laid the woman down gently, then unwrapped the baby from his coat and placed the child on a folded blanket nearby. The doctor moved quickly, checking pulses, lifting eyelids, listening to breathing. His face was grave. "The woman's severely dehydrated," he said, already reaching for a pitcher of water and clean cloths. "Sunstroke, malnutrition. She's lucky to be alive." He glanced at the baby. "The child's worse off. Infants can't survive long without milk." "Will they make it?" Caleb asked. The doctor met his eyes. "Depends on the next few hours. I'll do what I can." Caleb nodded. He stepped back, giving the man room to work, and found himself standing awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to leave or stay. "You can wait outside if you'd like," the doctor said without looking up. "This'll take a while." Caleb hesitated, then shook his head. "I'll stay." He sank into a wooden chair in the corner, hat in his hands, and watched as the doctor worked. The man moved with practiced efficiency, cleaning wounds, administering water drop by drop, wrapping the woman in damp cloths to bring her fever down. He prepared a sugar water mixture for the baby, coaxing the infant to take it from a rag twisted into a makeshift teat. Time stretched. The sun disappeared. Lamplight filled the room. Eventually, the woman's breathing steadied. The baby's cries quieted. The doctor straightened, wiping his hands on a towel, and looked at Caleb. "They'll live," he said simply, "but they'll need care, rest, food, and the baby needs milk, real milk, from a nursing mother or a goat. Do you know who they are?" Caleb shook his head. "Never seen them before." The doctor frowned. "You just found them out there. Alone." "That's right." "Any idea how they got there?" Caleb's jaw tightened. "Someone left them." The doctor's expression darkened. He said nothing for a moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll ask around. Someone might know something." He paused. "You planning to stay in town?" "For now," Caleb said. He hadn't planned to. But plans, he was learning, didn't mean much when a baby cried in the grass. The woman woke 2 hours before dawn. Caleb had dozed in the chair, his body refusing to fully relax, when he heard the rustle of fabric and a sharp, gasping breath. He opened his eyes to find her sitting upright in the bed, wild-eyed and trembling, her hands reaching instinctively for the empty space beside her. "Your baby's safe," Caleb said quickly, his voice low and steady. "Right here." Her head snapped toward him, and for a moment she just stared, confused, disoriented, afraid. Then her gaze found the small bundle on the table, wrapped in clean linen, and her entire body seemed to collapse inward with relief. "Ella," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. "Her name's Ella." Caleb nodded. "She's all right. Doctor fed her. She's sleeping." The woman's hands shook as she pressed them to her face. Her shoulders began to heave, and then she was crying, silent, wrenching sobs that seemed to tear out of her chest. Caleb looked away, giving her what privacy he could in the small room. When she finally quieted, he spoke. "What's your name?" She lowered her hands slowly. Her eyes were red, her face pale beneath the bruises and sunburn. "Eleanor," she said hoarsely. "Eleanor Hayes." "Caleb Ross." She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. Her gaze moved over his face, his worn clothes, the dust still clinging to his boots. "You found us," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah." "Why?" The question caught him off guard. He frowned. "What do you mean, why?" "Why did you stop?" Her voice was flat, empty. "Most men wouldn't have." Caleb met her eyes. "I'm not most men." Eleanor's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her gaze, something too tired to be hope, but too stubborn to be despair. She glanced at the baby again, then back at him. "My husband left us there," she said quietly. "He rode off and left us to die." The words hung in the air like smoke. Caleb didn't flinch. He'd suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed sent a cold, quiet anger rolling through his chest. "Why?" he asked. Eleanor's laugh was bitter and brittle. "Because I stopped being useful. Because Ella cried too much. Because he decided we were more trouble than we were worth." She looked down at her hands. "We were 3 days out from Omaha, heading to his brother's ranch in Montana. He said it was a fresh start." I believed him. Her voice cracked. "I believed him." Caleb said nothing. There were no words that would fix what had been broken. "He took the wagon," Eleanor continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Took the horse, the supplies, everything. Left us with nothing but the clothes on our backs." She closed her eyes. "I tried to walk. Thought maybe I could make it back to the trail, flag someone down. But it was so hot, and Ella, she wouldn't stop crying, and I ran out of water, and I just—" Her breath hitched. "I just couldn't go any farther." Caleb leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "You don't have to explain yourself to me." Eleanor opened her eyes, searching his face. "Why are you helping us?" "Because you needed help." "That's it?" "That's it." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to decide whether to believe him. Finally, she nodded, just once, and something in her posture softened. The baby stirred then, making a small, mewling sound. Eleanor turned toward her immediately, and Caleb stood, crossing the room to lift the bundle carefully and bring it to her. Eleanor took Ella with trembling hands, cradling her daughter close, and for the first time since she'd woken, she smiled, faint and fragile, but real. "Thank you," she whispered. Caleb nodded. "Get some rest. Both of you." He moved back to the chair, settling into it as Eleanor lay down with Ella tucked against her chest. Within minutes, both mother and child were asleep. Caleb sat in the dim lamplight watching them and wondered what the hell he'd gotten himself into. When dawn broke, the town of Ridgefield woke to the news that a stranger had brought in a woman and baby left for dead in the prairie. By the time Caleb stepped out of the doctor's office, a small crowd had gathered, curious faces, whispered conversations, sideways glances. He ignored them, heading for the livery to check on Ash and see about getting a room at the boarding house. The stable owner, a grizzled man with a limp and a pipe clenched between his teeth, looked up as Caleb approached. "You the one brought in that woman?" That's right. The man nodded slowly. Heard she was left out there by her own husband. Caleb's expression didn't change. That's what she said. Bastard. Caleb didn't argue. The stable owner puffed on his pipe. She got family? Anyone to look after her? Don't know, Caleb said. Haven't asked. Well, someone ought to. The man studied him. You staying long? Maybe. The man grunted. Boarding house is 2 doors down. Mrs. Fletcher runs it. Tell her Hank sent you. She'll give you a fair rate. Caleb nodded his thanks and headed down the street. Mrs. Fletcher turned out to be a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She took one look at Caleb, asked 3 questions, and handed him a key. Room's upstairs, second door on the left, she said. Meals are at 6, noon, and 6. You caused trouble. You're out. Clear? Clear, Caleb said. He climbed the narrow stairs, unlocked the door to a small, clean room with a bed, a chair, and a washstand, and set his saddlebags on the floor. Then he sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. He'd planned to be 100 miles away by now. Instead, he was stuck in a town he'd never heard of, responsible for 2 people he didn't know, with no clear idea of what came next. But when he thought about riding away, about leaving Eleanor and Ella to whatever fate awaited them, something in his chest tightened, and he knew he couldn't. Not yet. Maybe not ever. Boss. Eleanor stayed at the doctor's office for 3 more days, regaining her strength slowly. Caleb visited twice a day, bringing food from the boarding house and checking to make sure they had what they needed. He didn't say much, and neither did she, but a quiet understanding began to form between them, an unspoken agreement that he wasn't leaving, and she wasn't asking him to. On the 4th day, the doctor declared her well enough to move. Caleb arranged for her to take a room at Mrs. Fletcher's boarding house, paying a week's rent in advance without comment. Eleanor protested weakly, but Caleb silenced her with a look. You need a place to stay, he said simply. This is a place. She didn't argue after that. The room he secured for her was small but clean, with a window overlooking the street and enough space for a cradle the carpenter had donated after hearing her story. The women of Ridgefield had rallied quietly, bringing hand-me-down baby clothes, jars of preserved food, and a battered rocking chair that creaked but held steady. Eleanor accepted their kindness with the cautious gratitude of someone who'd learned not to trust generosity. But she thanked them, and she used what they gave her, and slowly, very slowly, she began to breathe again. Caleb, meanwhile, found work at the livery, mucking stalls and shoeing horses in exchange for room and board. It wasn't the kind of work that required thought, and that suited him fine. It gave his hands something to do and kept him close enough to check on Eleanor without hovering. He didn't know what he was doing. He only knew he wasn't ready to leave. Not while Eleanor still flinched at sudden movements. Not while Ella still cried in her sleep. Not while the shadow of the man who'd abandoned them hung over everything like a storm that hadn't yet broken. Because Caleb had seen enough of the world to know that men like Eleanor's husband didn't just disappear. They came back. They always came back. And when that happened, Caleb intended to be there. He owed them that much. Maybe he owed himself that much, too. For 3 years, he'd been running from his past, from the choices he'd made and the man he'd been. But out here, in this dusty little town with a woman and a baby who'd been left to die, he'd found something he hadn't expected. A reason to stop running, a reason to stay. And for the first time since the war, Caleb Ross felt like maybe, just maybe, he was exactly where he needed to be. The first week passed in a rhythm of careful distance and quiet watchfulness. Caleb kept to his work at the livery, arriving before dawn and staying until the last horse was fed. Eleanor kept to her room, emerging only for meals or to sit on the boarding house porch with Ella bundled against her chest, watching the town move around her like she was learning to trust the world again, one careful breath at a time. They spoke little, a nod in passing, a brief exchange about the weather, or whether Ella had slept through the night, nothing that required either of them to reveal more than they were ready to give. But Caleb noticed things. The way Eleanor's hands trembled when she counted out coins to pay Mrs. Fletcher for soap. The way she positioned herself in every room with her back to the wall and her eyes on the door. The way she startled at the sound of horses approaching, her body going rigid until she could see who was riding past. She was waiting for something. Or someone. Caleb knew that particular kind of fear. He'd seen it in soldiers after battles, in women who'd survived things that should have killed them, in children who'd learned too young that the world was a dangerous place. It was the fear of knowing that safety was temporary, that peace could shatter without warning, that the worst wasn't over just because you'd survived the first blow. So he stayed close. Not intrusive, not obvious, just present. A steady figure she could count on seeing when she looked out her window in the morning or stepped onto the porch at dusk. He didn't know if it helped, but he knew it was all he had to offer. On the 8th day, Eleanor came to the livery. Caleb was replacing a loose shoe on a bay mare when he heard the creak of the stable door. He looked up to find Eleanor standing in the doorway, Ella asleep in a sling tied across her chest. The late afternoon sun backlit her silhouette, and for a moment she looked like something out of a dream, fragile and determined all at once. "Can I talk to you?" she asked. Caleb set down his hammer and straightened, wiping his hands on his pants. "Sure." She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The smell of hay and horse and leather filled the air between them. She didn't come closer, just stood a few feet away with her arms wrapped protectively around Ella. "I need to find work," she said quietly. "I can't keep taking charity. Mrs. Fletcher's been kind, but I can't pay my rent much longer, and I need—" She stopped, swallowed. "I need to be able to take care of my daughter." Caleb nodded slowly. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Anything. Laundry, mending, cooking. I can read and write. I taught school back in Ohio before— She caught herself, and her jaw tightened. "Before I got married." "You want to teach again?" Eleanor's expression flickered with something that might have been longing. "The town doesn't have a school, just the church on Sundays where Pastor Dalton teaches the children their letters. I asked him if he needed help, but he said—" She paused, and a bitter edge crept into her voice. "He said it wouldn't be appropriate for a woman in my situation to teach children." Caleb's hands stilled. "Your situation? A woman who was abandoned by her husband, who might still be married, depending on how the law sees it, who showed up in town with nothing but the clothes on her back and a baby." Eleanor's voice was flat, but her eyes burned. He didn't say it outright, but the meaning was clear. "I'm a scandal, a cautionary tale, not fit to influence young minds." Anger, slow and cold, unfurled in Caleb's chest. He kept his voice level. "That's bullshit." Eleanor blinked, clearly not expecting the bluntness. Then, despite everything, the corner of her mouth twitched. "Yes," she said. "It is." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of unspoken truth settling between them. "I'll ask around," Caleb said finally. "See if anyone needs help. There's got to be something." Eleanor nodded. "Thank you." She hesitated, then added, "You've done enough already, you know. More than enough. You don't owe me anything." Caleb met her eyes. "I know." She studied his face, searching for something. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her because she nodded again and turned to leave. At the door, she paused. "Caleb?" "Yeah?" "Why are you still here?" The question hung in the dusty air. Caleb considered his answer carefully. "Because I want to be," he said. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, then walked out into the fading light. By the end of the week, Caleb had found her work. Mrs. Fletcher needed help with the boarding house laundry, and the general store owner's wife was willing to pay for mending. It wasn't much, but it was something, enough to cover Eleanor's rent and buy milk for Ella. Eleanor threw herself into the work with a quiet ferocity that reminded Caleb of soldiers who kept moving because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. She washed sheets until her hands were raw, stitched torn hems by lamplight while Ella slept, and never once complained. The town, for its part, began to accept her presence. Not warmly, exactly, but with the grudging tolerance of people who'd seen enough hardship to recognize it in others. The women brought her small kindnesses, a loaf of bread, a jar of honey, a blanket for the baby. The men tipped their hats when they passed her on the street. No one asked questions, but the whispers followed her anyway. Caleb heard them in the saloon, in the general store, in the spaces between polite conversation. "Shame what happened to her. Can't trust a man who'd leave his own child. Wonder if he'll come back for her. Wonder if she wants him to." Caleb said nothing, but he listened, and he watched the road. 3 weeks after Eleanor arrived in Ridgefield, the man Caleb had been waiting for finally showed up. It was a Tuesday afternoon, hot and still, the kind of day where the town moved slowly and people sought shade wherever they could find it. Caleb was in the livery, checking Ash's hooves, when Hank appeared in the doorway. "Got a visitor?" Hank said, his voice carefully neutral. "Looking for his wife and baby." Caleb's hands stilled. "What's he look like?" "Tall, clean-shaven, good clothes, riding a sorrel mare with silver on the saddle. Got the look of a man used to getting what he wants." Hank paused. "He's at the boarding house now." Caleb was already moving. He grabbed his hat and strode out of the livery, his boots kicking up dust as he crossed the street. His heart hammered in his chest, but his hands were steady. This was what he'd been preparing for, what he'd known was coming. He reached the boarding house just as raised voices spilled out through the open window of Eleanor's room. "You had no right. I had every right. You're my wife. You left us to die." "I came back, didn't I?" Caleb took the porch steps 2 at a time and pushed through the front door. Mrs. Fletcher was standing at the base of the stairs, her face tight with worry. "Second door on the right," she said quietly. "I tried to stop him, but—" Caleb was already climbing. He reached Eleanor's room and found the door half open. Through the gap, he could see a man standing in the center of the small space, tall, well-dressed, his posture radiating entitlement and barely controlled rage. Eleanor stood between him and the cradle where Ella slept, her body a shield, her face pale but defiant. "You will come with me," the man was saying, his voice low and venomous. "You and the child. We're leaving today." "No," Eleanor said. Her voice shook, but it didn't break. "I'm not going anywhere with you." The man's jaw tightened. "You don't have a choice, Eleanor. You're my wife. That's my daughter. The law—" "The law?" Eleanor's laugh was sharp and bitter. "You invoke the law now? After you left us in the middle of nowhere with no food, no water, no way to survive? You wanted us dead, Thomas. Don't pretend otherwise." Thomas Hayes took a step forward, and Eleanor flinched despite herself. Caleb saw the motion, saw the fear flash across her face, and something inside him snapped cold and final. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. Thomas spun around, his hand moving instinctively toward the pistol at his hip. Caleb stood perfectly still, his gaze locked on the other man. "You need to leave," Caleb said quietly. Thomas's eyes narrowed. "Who the hell are you?" "Someone who's asking you politely to walk out that door. This is none of your business." "I'm making it my business." Thomas looked him up and down, taking in the worn clothes, the dusty boots, the calloused hands. His lip curled. "You're the one who found them, the drifter." He turned back to Eleanor. "Is this who you've been staying with? Is this why you won't come home?" Eleanor's face flushed with anger. "I'm staying here because you tried to kill me." "I did no such thing," Thomas snapped. "You got yourself lost. That's not my fault. You took the wagon and left us on foot in the middle of the prairie. You were slowing us down, you and that screaming brat." Caleb moved before he could think. He crossed the room in 2 strides, grabbed Thomas by the collar, and slammed him back against the wall, hard enough to rattle the window frame. "Call her that again," Caleb said, his voice deadly calm, "and I'll put you through that wall." Thomas's eyes went wide with shock, then fury. He shoved at Caleb's chest, but Caleb didn't budge. For a moment they stood locked together, violence crackling in the air between them. Then Eleanor spoke. "Let him go." Caleb's gaze flicked to her. She was standing straight now, her arms wrapped around herself, her chin lifted. There was no fear in her eyes anymore, only cold, quiet rage. "Let him go," she repeated. "He's not worth it." Caleb held Thomas's gaze for another heartbeat, then released him and stepped back. Thomas stumbled, smoothing his rumpled collar with shaking hands, his face mottled with humiliation and fury. "You'll regret this," he hissed, looking between them. "Both of you." "Get out," Eleanor said. Thomas straightened, pulling what remained of his dignity around him like armor. "I'll be back," he said, "with the law. A wife belongs to her husband. That's the way it is." "Then bring the law," Eleanor said, "and I'll tell them exactly what you did." Thomas's jaw worked, but he said nothing. He shot one last venomous glare at Caleb, then turned and stalked out of the room. They heard his boots on the stairs, the slam of the front door, the sound of hooves as he rode away. Silence filled the room. Eleanor sank slowly onto the edge of the bed, her hands pressed to her face. Her shoulders shook, but no sound came out. Caleb stood awkwardly near the door, unsure whether to stay or go. Then Ella began to cry, a soft mewling sound that broke the tension. Eleanor stood immediately, crossing to the cradle and lifting her daughter into her arms. She rocked her gently, murmuring soft reassurances, and gradually the baby quieted. "He meant it," Eleanor said finally, her voice hollow. "He'll come back with the law. He'll take her from me." "No, he won't," Caleb said. Eleanor looked at him, her eyes red-rimmed. "You don't know that." "I know the law favors husbands," Caleb said carefully, "but it also takes abandonment seriously. You've got witnesses now, the doctor, Mrs. Fletcher, half the town. They saw what shape you were in. They know what he did." "It won't matter," Eleanor whispered. "I'm still his wife. Ella's still his daughter. The law will side with him because that's what the law does." Caleb was silent for a moment. Then he said, "What if you weren't his wife anymore?" Eleanor frowned. "What?" "What if there was a way to make the law see you as someone else's responsibility, someone who could claim legal right to protect you?" Understanding dawned slowly on Eleanor's face, followed by disbelief. "You mean marriage," Caleb said. "If we were married, legally, Thomas couldn't touch you, or Ella." Eleanor stared at him. "You can't be serious." "I am." "Caleb, that's insane. You don't even know me." "I know enough. You'd bind yourself to a woman with a child, with a past, with a husband who might fight you every step of the way, just to protect us?" Caleb met her eyes. "Yes." Eleanor shook her head slowly, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Why? Why would you do that?" The answer came easier than Caleb expected. "Because it's the right thing to do. And because I want to." She searched his face, looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that he didn't mean it. She found none. "I can't ask you to do this," she said quietly. "You're not asking," Caleb said. "I'm offering." Eleanor looked down at Ella, her expression unreadable. The baby had fallen back asleep, her tiny hand curled against her mother's chest. For a long moment, Eleanor said nothing. Then she looked up at Caleb and said, "All right." Caleb blinked. "All right?" "Yes." Her voice was steady now, stronger. "If you're willing, then yes. I'll marry you." Something shifted in Caleb's chest, something he couldn't name and didn't try to. He nodded once. "Okay." "Okay," Eleanor echoed. They stood in the quiet room, the magnitude of what they'd just agreed to settling over them like dust after a storm. Outside, the town moved on, unaware that two strangers had just made a decision that would change everything. Caleb cleared his throat. "I'll talk to the pastor tomorrow, see what needs to be done." Eleanor nodded. "And I'll figure out what to tell people." "Tell them the truth," Caleb said, "that we're getting married. Everything else is nobody's business." A faint, fragile smile touched Eleanor's lips. "Thank you, Caleb." He nodded and turned to go. At the door, he paused. "Eleanor?" "Yes?" "We'll get through this," he said. "Whatever comes. We'll get through it." She looked at him, this quiet man who'd pulled her from the edge of death and asked for nothing in return, who'd stood between her and violence without hesitation, who was now offering her the only protection the law would recognize. "I believe you," she said softly. And for the first time in a very long time, Eleanor Hayes felt something that almost resembled hope. The next morning, Caleb walked to the church and found Pastor Dalton sweeping the steps. The man looked up as Caleb approached, his expression guarded. "Mr. Ross," he said coolly, "what can I do for you?" "I want to get married," Caleb said without preamble. "To Eleanor Hayes as soon as possible." Pastor Dalton's brow furrowed. "Mrs. Hayes is already married." "Her husband abandoned her," Caleb said evenly. "Left her and her baby to die in the prairie. That's grounds for annulment, isn't it?" "It's complicated," the pastor hedged. The law says a man has a duty to provide for his wife and children," Caleb interrupted. Thomas Hayes violated that duty. Eleanor wants to dissolve the marriage. I'm asking you to help her do it." Pastor Dalton set his broom aside, his face troubled. "Even if I agree, these things take time. Petitions, hearings, testimony?" "Then start the process," Caleb said. "Today." The pastor studied him for a long moment. "You're serious about this? Dead serious? You understand what you're taking on? A woman with a child, a complicated past, a husband who may well fight this?" "I understand." Pastor Dalton sighed. "Why are you doing this, Mr. Ross?" Caleb held his gaze. "Because she needs help, and because I can give it." The pastor was quiet, weighing Caleb's words. Finally, he nodded. "All right. I'll speak to the circuit judge when he comes through next week. In the meantime, I'll need statements from both of you, and from anyone who can testify to Mrs. Hayes's condition when she arrived." "You'll have them," Caleb said. As he walked back through town, Caleb felt the weight of what he'd set in motion. This wasn't just a legal maneuver. It was a line drawn in the dust, a challenge to Thomas Hayes and anyone else who thought Eleanor was something to be owned and discarded. And when Thomas came back, and he would come back, Caleb intended to be standing right where he was now, between Eleanor and whatever storm was coming, because that's what a man did when he made a promise. He kept it. The circuit judge arrived in Ridgefield on a Thursday, riding in a mud-spattered coach with 2 law clerks and a stack of case files that looked like it could bury a small horse. His name was Horace Brennan, and he had the weathered face of a man who'd spent 40 years listening to people lie, cheat, and justify their worst impulses in the name of justice. Pastor Dalton met him at the hotel, and over dinner laid out Eleanor's case. Caleb wasn't there for that conversation, but he heard about it later from Mrs. Fletcher, who had it from the hotel cook, who'd been eavesdropping through the kitchen door. The judge had listened without comment, asked 3 questions, and said he'd hear the matter the following Monday in the church hall. That gave them 4 days. 4 days for Thomas Hayes to hear about it and come back with lawyers, money, and whatever leverage he could buy. 4 days for Eleanor to prepare herself to stand in front of a room full of strangers and recount the worst moments of her life. 4 days for Caleb to wonder if he'd made a promise he couldn't keep. He found Eleanor that evening sitting on the boarding house porch, Ella asleep in her arms, staring at the empty street like she was watching for ghosts. "Judge set the hearing for Monday," Caleb said quietly, settling into the chair beside her. Eleanor didn't look at him. "I know. Mrs. Fletcher told me." They sat in silence for a while, the evening cicadas starting their chorus, the last light bleeding out of the sky. "You don't have to do this," Eleanor said finally. "Any of it. You could leave tonight, and no one would blame you." Caleb looked at her. "You think I would?" "I think you're a good man who got caught up in something that isn't your fight." "It is my fight," Caleb said. "The moment I picked you up off that prairie, it became my fight." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "He'll destroy you if he can. Thomas doesn't lose, Caleb. He doesn't know how. He'll bring lawyers, he'll lie, he'll paint me as unfaithful or insane or worse, and they'll believe him because men like him always get believed." "Let him try," Caleb said evenly. Eleanor finally turned to look at him, her eyes searching his face. "Why aren't you afraid?" "I am afraid," Caleb admitted, "but not of him." "Then what?" Caleb was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I'm afraid of walking away and spending the rest of my life wondering what happened to you. Whether you and Ella were all right. Whether you got the chance you deserved." He met her gaze. "That scares me more than any courtroom." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Caleb said. "Wait till we win." She almost smiled at that. Almost. Saturday morning, Pastor Dalton came by the boarding house with a list of witnesses he'd compiled. The doctor who'd treated Eleanor and Ella, Hank from the livery who'd seen them arrive, Mrs. Fletcher who'd given them shelter, and 3 townswomen who'd helped Eleanor in those first desperate weeks. He also had a document for Eleanor to sign, a formal petition for annulment on grounds of abandonment and endangerment. Eleanor sat at the small table in her room, the pen trembling in her hand as she read through the legal language that reduced her suffering to cold, dispassionate phrases. Desertion. Willful neglect. Failure to provide. She signed it with her married name one last time, the ink stark and final. Caleb watched from the doorway, saying nothing, but his presence was a steady anchor in the room. "What happens if the judge denies it?" Eleanor asked quietly, setting down the pen. Pastor Dalton folded the document carefully. "Then you remain legally married to Thomas Hayes, and he retains all parental rights to Ella." He paused. "But Judge Brennan is fair. If the evidence is strong and the testimony holds, he'll grant the annulment. And then Caleb and I can marry?" "Yes, immediately, if you wish." Eleanor nodded, her face pale but composed. "Then let's make sure the evidence holds." The next 2 days passed in a strange suspension of time. Eleanor prepared her testimony with Pastor Dalton, going over every detail of what had happened, steeling herself to speak words she'd barely allowed herself to think. Caleb spent his time talking to the witnesses, making sure everyone understood what was at stake, gathering every scrap of evidence that might sway the judge's decision. On Sunday, the church service was tense with unspoken anticipation. Eleanor sat in the back row with Ella, her head held high despite the whispers and sideways glances. Caleb sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, a silent declaration that she wasn't alone. When Pastor Dalton's sermon turned to the parable of the Good Samaritan, Eleanor felt Caleb glance at her, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that sometimes the stranger on the road was the only one who stopped to help, while those who should have cared walked by. Monday morning arrived cold and gray, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. The church hall had been arranged like a makeshift courtroom, with Judge Brennan seated behind a table at the front, his clerks flanking him with ledgers and law books. Benches had been set up for witnesses and spectators, and by 9 o'clock the room was full. Eleanor sat in the front row with Caleb beside her and Ella bundled in her arms. Across the aisle, Thomas Hayes sat with a lawyer from Omaha, a slick-looking man in an expensive suit who smiled like a predator scenting blood. Judge Brennan called the proceedings to order with a sharp rap of his gavel, and the room fell silent. "We're here to consider a petition for annulment filed by Eleanor Hayes against her husband, Thomas Hayes, on grounds of desertion and endangerment," the judge said, his voice carrying easily through the hall. "This is a civil matter, but it has serious implications for the welfare of a child, so I expect honesty, respect, and decorum from everyone present. Is that understood?" Murmurs of assent rippled through the crowd. "Mrs. Hayes," the judge continued, looking directly at Eleanor, "you've brought this petition. You'll have the first opportunity to present your case." Eleanor stood slowly, her legs unsteady beneath her. She handed Ella to Caleb, who took the baby carefully, cradling her against his chest with a gentleness that made Eleanor's throat tighten. Then she walked to the front of the room and turned to face the judge. "Your Honor," she began, her voice quiet but clear, "my name is Eleanor Hayes. 3 months ago, my husband left me and our infant daughter in the Dakota prairie with no food, no water, and no way to survive. He took our wagon, our horse, and all our supplies, and he rode away knowing we would die." The room was utterly silent. "I tried to walk back to the trail," Eleanor continued. "I thought if I could reach the road, someone might find us. But it was August, and the heat was—" She stopped, swallowed. "I collapsed after a few hours. My daughter was dying of dehydration in my arms. If Mr. Ross hadn't found us by chance, we wouldn't be here today." Judge Brennan leaned forward slightly. "Why did your husband leave you, Mrs. Hayes?" Eleanor's hands clenched at her sides. "He said we were slowing him down, that Ella cried too much, that I was—" her voice faltered, then steadied, "that I was more trouble than I was worth." "Did he say this explicitly?" "Yes, Your Honor. The morning he left, he told me he was going ahead to scout the trail. He said he'd be back by noon, but when noon came and went, I realized he'd taken everything. There were wheel tracks leading west, and I followed them until I couldn't walk anymore." She looked directly at the judge. "He meant for us to die, Your Honor. There's no other explanation." Thomas Hayes' lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. My client's intentions are being mischaracterized." "Sit down, Counselor," Judge Brennan said mildly. "You'll have your turn." He looked back at Eleanor. "Continue, Mrs. Hayes." Eleanor told the rest. The heat, the thirst, the moment she'd realized they wouldn't make it, the sound of Caleb's horse, the haze of the doctor's office, waking up to learn she'd been saved. She spoke steadily without dramatics, and that made it more powerful. When she finished, there wasn't a dry eye among the women in the room, and several of the men looked like they wanted to drag Thomas Hayes outside and settle the matter without a judge. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes," Judge Brennan said quietly. "You may sit down." Eleanor returned to her seat, her legs shaking so badly she nearly stumbled. Caleb shifted Ella to one arm and reached out to steady her with his free hand. She gripped his fingers for a moment, drawing strength, then let go. The doctor was called next. He testified to Eleanor's condition when she'd arrived: severe dehydration, malnutrition, heat stroke, injuries consistent with prolonged exposure. He described Ella's state, the desperate measures he'd taken to save her, the fact that another few hours would have been fatal. "In your medical opinion," Judge Brennan asked, "was this the result of accidental abandonment or deliberate neglect?" The doctor didn't hesitate. "Deliberate, Your Honor. No man leaves his wife and infant child on foot in the prairie by accident." Thomas's lawyer stood again. "Your Honor, my client maintains that Mrs. Hayes wandered off while he was scouting ahead and became disoriented. He searched for hours before concluding she must have made it back to the last town they'd passed." "Then why didn't he report her missing?" Judge Brennan asked sharply. "Why didn't he return to look for her?" The lawyer opened his mouth, closed it, then tried again. "My client was under the impression that his wife was resourceful enough to survive 3 days in the wilderness with an infant and no supplies." The judge's tone could have cut glass. "That's your argument?" The lawyer sat down, his face tight. Hank testified next, describing the day Caleb had ridden into town with Eleanor and Ella, barely alive. Mrs. Fletcher spoke about Eleanor's condition, her terror every time a horse approached, the way she'd worked herself to exhaustion to earn her keep rather than accept charity. One by one, the witnesses built a picture of a woman who'd been left to die and had survived through sheer will and the intervention of a stranger. Then it was Thomas Hayes's turn to speak. He took the stand with the confidence of a man who'd never been held accountable for anything in his life. He wore a freshly pressed suit, his hair slicked back, his expression one of wounded dignity. "Your Honor," he began, "I deeply regret the misunderstanding that led to this unfortunate situation. I never intended for my wife to be placed in danger. When I scouted ahead that morning, I believe she understood she was to wait with the wagon. When I returned and found her gone, I assumed she'd grown impatient and started walking back to the last settlement. I searched for several hours, but the trail was unclear, and I had to make a difficult decision: continue to my brother's ranch and send help back, or waste more time on a search that might be fruitless." "You chose to continue to your brother's ranch," Judge Brennan said flatly. "Yes, Your Honor. I thought it was the most logical course of action." "And did you send help back?" Thomas hesitated for just a fraction of a second. "I sent word to the authorities in Omaha, yes." "When?" Approximately 2 weeks after I arrived at the ranch." 2 weeks, the judge repeated. "Your wife and child were missing for 2 weeks before you bothered to inform anyone?" "I was waiting for confirmation that they hadn't already been found," Thomas said smoothly. "I didn't want to cause unnecessary alarm." Eleanor made a sound, half laugh, half sob. Caleb's hand found hers and held tight. Judge Brennan leaned back in his chair, his eyes cold. "Mr. Hayes, I've been doing this job for a long time, and I've heard every excuse, every justification, every lie a man can tell to avoid responsibility. So let me be very clear. I don't believe a word you just said." Thomas's composure cracked slightly. "Your Honor, with all due respect—" "You left your wife to die," the judge said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "You took the wagon, the horse, the supplies, and you rode away knowing full well that she and your infant daughter would not survive. You did this deliberately, and you did it because you wanted to be rid of them. The only reason you're here now is because she lived, and that complicates your plans." Thomas's face flushed red. "That's a baseless accusation." "Is it?" Judge Brennan gestured to the stack of testimony on his desk. "Because every witness here tells the same story. A woman and baby left to die. A man who didn't look back. The evidence speaks for itself, Mr. Hayes." Thomas's lawyer stood quickly. "Your Honor, even if we accept Mrs. Hayes's version of events, that doesn't justify dissolving a legal marriage. My client is willing to reconcile, to provide for his wife and child, to— He's willing now because the law might force him to, the judge interrupted. Where was this willingness 3 months ago? He looked at Eleanor. Mrs. Hayes, do you wish to reconcile with your husband? Eleanor stood, her voice steady and clear. No, Your Honor, I do not. Do you fear for your safety and the safety of your child if you return to him? Yes, Your Honor, I do. Judge Brennan nodded slowly. Then he looked at Caleb. Mr. Ross, stand up. Caleb handed Ella to Mrs. Fletcher and stood, his hat in his hands. You're the man who found Mrs. Hayes and her daughter? Yes, sir. And you've agreed to marry her if this annulment is granted? Yes, sir. Why? The question hung in the air. Caleb met the judge's gaze without flinching. Because she deserves better than what she got, Caleb said simply, and because I can give her that. You understand that you'll be taking on legal responsibility for both her and the child? Yes, sir. And you're prepared for the possibility that Mr. Hayes may challenge this arrangement? I am. Judge Brennan studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Sit down, Mr. Ross. Caleb sat. The judge shuffled through his papers, his expression unreadable. The room held its collective breath. Finally, Judge Brennan looked up. In the matter of Eleanor Hayes versus Thomas Hayes, he said, I find that the petitioner has provided clear and convincing evidence of willful desertion and endangerment. The marriage is hereby annulled, effective immediately. Mrs. Hayes is free to remarry without restriction. He paused, then looked directly at Thomas. Furthermore, I am awarding sole custody of the minor child, Ella Hayes, to her mother. Mr. Hayes, you are prohibited from contacting Mrs. Hayes or the child without a court order. Any attempt to do so will result in criminal charges. Do you understand? Thomas's face had gone from red to white. Your Honor, this is— Do you understand? The judge repeated, his voice like iron. Thomas's jaw worked. Yes, he finally ground out. Then we're done here. Judge Brennan brought his gavel down with a sharp crack. This court is adjourned. The room erupted in whispers and movement. Eleanor sat frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Caleb leaned close, his voice low and steady in her ear. It's over, he said. You're free. Eleanor turned to look at him, tears streaming down her face, and for the first time in months, she felt the crushing weight on her chest begin to lift. But Thomas Hayes wasn't finished. As the crowd began to disperse, he shoved past his lawyer and strode toward Eleanor, his face contorted with rage. Caleb was on his feet instantly, putting himself between them, but Thomas didn't stop. This isn't over, Thomas snarled, his finger jabbing toward Eleanor. You think you can humiliate me like this? You think I'll just walk away? You don't have a choice, Caleb said, his voice dangerously quiet. I have every choice, Thomas spat. She's mine. That child is mine, and I will— He didn't finish the sentence. Caleb's fist connected with his jaw in a blur of motion, sending Thomas stumbling backward into the benches. The lawyer yelped and scrambled out of the way. Judge Brennan's gavel cracked again, but Caleb barely heard it. Thomas hauled himself upright, blood trickling from his split lip, his eyes wild. You'll pay for that, he hissed. Both of you will— Mr. Hayes, Judge Brennan's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. One more word, and I'll hold you in contempt. Get out of my courtroom, now. Two of the townsmen stepped forward, taking Thomas by the arms and hauling him toward the door. He struggled for a moment, then went limp, allowing himself to be dragged out. His lawyer followed, muttering apologies to the judge. The door slammed shut, and silence fell. Judge Brennan looked at Caleb, who stood with his fists still clenched, breathing hard. Mr. Ross, I should hold you in contempt as well. Yes, sir, Caleb said. The judge's mouth twitched. But I won't. Consider it a wedding gift. He stood, gathering his papers. Pastor Dalton, if these two want to get married, you have my blessing to perform the ceremony today. The annulment is official as of this moment. Pastor Dalton nodded, looking somewhat dazed. Yes, Your Honor. Judge Brennan looked at Eleanor, and his expression softened. Mrs. Hayes, you're a brave woman. I hope you find the happiness you deserve. Eleanor couldn't speak. She just nodded, tears still streaming down her face. The judge left, his clerks trailing behind him. The crowd began to filter out, murmuring among themselves. Mrs. Fletcher brought Ella back to Eleanor, and the baby, sensing her mother's emotion, began to fuss. Caleb flexed his hand, wincing slightly. Eleanor saw the split skin across his knuckles and reached for him without thinking. "You're hurt," she said. "It's nothing," Caleb said. Eleanor looked up at him, this man who'd fought for her without hesitation, who'd stood between her and violence twice now, who'd offered her a future when she'd thought she had none. "Marry me," she said. Caleb blinked. "What?" "Now, today, like the judge said." Eleanor's voice was steady now, sure. "I don't want to wait. I don't want to give Thomas any more time to—" She stopped, took a breath. "I want this to be over. I want to be your wife, legally, so no one can ever question it." Caleb searched her face. "You're sure?" "I'm sure. He nodded slowly. "All right." Pastor Dalton stepped forward, clearing his throat. "If you're both certain, I can perform the ceremony now. We'll need 2 witnesses." "I'll stand witness," Mrs. Fletcher said immediately. "And I will," Hank added from the back of the room. Eleanor looked around at the few people still remaining. The doctor, the townswomen who'd helped her, the men who'd testified on her behalf. They were all watching with varying degrees of approval, curiosity, and concern. "Then let's do it," Eleanor said. Pastor Dalton retrieved his Bible and called Caleb and Eleanor to stand before him. Mrs. Fletcher held Ella, the baby's small hand wrapped around her finger. Hank stood to one side, his hat in his hands, looking both honored and slightly uncomfortable. The ceremony was brief and simple. Pastor Dalton spoke the traditional words, his voice resonating through the quiet hall. Caleb and Eleanor repeated their vows, their voices steady despite the enormity of what they were doing. When the pastor asked for rings, Caleb hesitated, then pulled off the leather cord he wore around his wrist. A simple thing, worn smooth with age. He tied it gently around Eleanor's ring finger, the gesture oddly intimate. Eleanor had nothing to give in return, but Caleb shook his head when she started to apologize. "Don't need a ring," he said quietly. "Just need your word." "You have it," Eleanor said. Pastor Dalton smiled. "Then by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife." He paused. "You may kiss the bride, if you wish." Caleb and Eleanor looked at each other, suddenly aware of how little they actually knew each other, how strange this moment was. Then Caleb leaned forward and pressed a brief, chaste kiss to Eleanor's forehead, a gesture of protection and promise rather than passion. "It's done," he said softly. Eleanor nodded, something loosening in her chest. "It's done." Mrs. Fletcher handed Ella back to Eleanor, and the baby immediately snuggled against her mother, content. The small group offered quiet congratulations, shook Caleb's hand, embraced Eleanor carefully. And then, slowly, they filtered out, leaving the new couple standing alone in the empty hall. Eleanor looked down at the leather cord around her finger, then up at Caleb. "What now?" Caleb considered the question. "Now we figure out how to be a family." "Do you know how?" "No," Caleb admitted. "Do you?" Eleanor thought about her own family, distant, disapproving, silent when she'd needed them most. She thought about Thomas and the hollow shell of a marriage that had nearly killed her. Then she looked at Caleb, the stranger who'd become her husband in the span of a few desperate weeks. "No," she said. "But maybe that's all right. Maybe we get to make it up as we go." Caleb smiled. A real smile, the first she'd seen from him. "Yeah," he said. "Maybe we do." They walked out of the church hall together into the gray afternoon, Ella asleep between them, and for the first time since she'd collapsed in the grass all those weeks ago, Eleanor felt like she could breathe. The rain that had threatened all morning finally broke as they walked back to the boarding house, fat drops that turned the street to mud and sent people scrambling for cover. Eleanor held Ella close beneath her shawl while Caleb walked beside them, his hat pulled low, saying nothing but present, in a way that felt more solid than any vow they'd just spoken. Mrs. Fletcher met them at the door with towels and a knowing look. I've made up the room at the end of the hall, she said to Caleb, her voice carefully neutral. It's bigger than what you've been staying in. Has space for the cradle and such. Caleb nodded his thanks, understanding what she was offering without saying it outright. A room for a family, not a drifter passing through. Eleanor changed Ella's damp clothes and settled her in the cradle, then stood at the window watching the rain come down in sheets. Behind her, she heard Caleb moving quietly around the room, unpacking his few belongings from the saddlebag he'd carried up from his old quarters. A spare shirt, a whetstone, a small leather-bound book that looked like it had been read 1,000 times. He set them on the bureau with careful precision, like he was trying not to take up too much space. You can use the whole drawer, Eleanor said without turning around. I don't have much. Neither do I, Caleb replied. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable exactly, but weighted with awareness. They were married now. This was their room, their life. And neither of them had any idea what that was supposed to look like. Eleanor turned from the window. I should thank you properly, she said, for everything, for what you did in court today, for... You don't need to thank me, Caleb interrupted gently. Yes, I do. You stood up to Thomas when you didn't have to. You married me when you could have just walked away. You gave me and Ella a chance at a future. Her voice wavered. That deserves more than just thank you, but I don't know what else to say. Caleb set down the shirt he'd been folding and looked at her directly. You don't owe me gratitude, Eleanor, and you don't owe me anything else either. I know this marriage isn't... He paused, searching for words. It's not a real marriage. Not in the way most people mean it. It's a legal arrangement to keep you safe, that's all. Something in Eleanor's chest tightened at his words, though she couldn't have said why. So what are the rules? Rules? Between us. What do you expect from this arrangement? Caleb was quiet for a moment. I expect us to be honest with each other, to do right by Ella. Beyond that, he shrugged. I figure we'll work it out as we go. Eleanor nodded slowly. And if Thomas comes back? Then we deal with it together, Caleb said. That's what married people do, isn't it? Despite everything, Eleanor felt the corner of her mouth lift. I suppose it is. The rain continued through the afternoon and into the evening, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and wet. Mrs. Fletcher brought up dinner on a tray, beef stew and fresh bread, more generous portions than usual, along with a slice of apple cake she claimed was left over from Sunday, but which Eleanor suspected had been made special for the occasion. They ate together at the small table by the window, Ella asleep in her cradle, the awkwardness between them gradually easing into something more bearable. Caleb asked about Eleanor's life before Thomas, and she told him carefully edited stories about growing up in Ohio, teaching school, the small dreams she'd had before everything had gone wrong. In return, Caleb offered fragments of his own past, Missouri, the war, the restlessness that had driven him west. He didn't talk about the fighting, and Eleanor didn't press. She recognized the shape of silence around certain subjects, the way a person learned to step around the painful parts of their history. When the meal was finished, Caleb stood to take the tray downstairs. You should rest, he said. It's been a long day. Eleanor looked at the bed, then at Caleb, suddenly aware of the question neither of them had addressed. Where will you sleep? Caleb followed her gaze, then nodded toward the worn armchair in the corner. I've slept in worse places. That's not... Eleanor stopped, flushed. We're married. People can expect whatever they want, Caleb said evenly. This is between us, and I'm not going to make you uncomfortable in your own room. Eleanor wanted to argue, to point out that it was his room too now, that he'd earned the right to a decent night's sleep, but the relief that flooded through her at his words was too strong to ignore. She wasn't ready. Not for that. Maybe not ever. Thank you, she said quietly. Caleb nodded and carried the tray out. When he returned, he dragged the armchair closer to the cradle and settled into it with his book, giving Eleanor the privacy to prepare for bed. She changed behind the screen in the corner, braided her hair, and slipped under the quilts, acutely aware of every sound. The rustle of pages turning, the creak of the chair, Caleb's quiet breathing. She'd shared a room with Thomas for 2 years of marriage and had never felt as safe as she did in this moment, with a man she barely knew reading in a chair 10 feet away. The thought should have troubled her. Instead, it let her close her eyes and sleep. The next morning dawned clear and cold. The rain-washed sky stretched pale blue over Ridgefield. Eleanor woke to find Caleb already up, the armchair empty and the room quiet except for Ella's soft breathing. She dressed quickly and went downstairs to find him in the dining room, nursing a cup of coffee and talking in low tones with Hank. Both men looked up as she approached, and something in their expressions made her stomach clench. "What's wrong?" she asked. Hank glanced at Caleb, then at Eleanor. "Thomas Hayes didn't leave town yesterday. He's still here, staying at the hotel." Eleanor's breath caught. "Why would he stay?" "Can't say for certain," Hank said carefully, "but he's been asking questions. About you, about Caleb, about property law and custody rights. He's also been drinking, and when Thomas Hayes drinks, he gets mean." "How do you know this?" "Bartender's my cousin. He sent word this morning." Hank shifted his weight. "Thought you should know." Eleanor sank into the nearest chair, her legs suddenly unsteady. "The judge ordered him to stay away." "The judge isn't here anymore," Caleb said quietly. "He left on the morning coach." The words settled over her like a weight. Of course Thomas had waited. He was smart enough to know that legal orders only mattered when there was someone around to enforce them. "What do we do?" Eleanor asked. Caleb's jaw tightened. "We stay alert. Don't go anywhere alone. If he approaches you, you walk away and you find me. Understand?" Eleanor nodded, hating the fear that crept back into her chest. The way her hands trembled as she reached for the coffee Caleb pushed toward her. "He can't do anything," she said, trying to convince herself as much as them. "The annulment is legal. The marriage is legal. He has no claim." "Men like Thomas don't care about claims," Hank said bluntly. "They care about pride. And you damaged his yesterday in front of half the town." Eleanor knew he was right. She'd seen that look in Thomas's eyes when the judge ruled against him. The cold, calculating rage of a man who'd been publicly humiliated and would do anything to restore his sense of control. She looked at Caleb. "I'm sorry. I've brought this down on you." "Stop apologizing," Caleb said, not unkindly. "We knew this might happen. We'll handle it." But as the day wore on, the tension in town became palpable. Word had spread that Thomas Hayes was still in Ridgefield, still nursing his grievances, still making noise about how he'd been wronged. People looked at Eleanor with a mixture of sympathy and wariness, like she was a lightning rod for trouble they didn't want in their peaceful town. Caleb accompanied her everywhere, to the general store to pick up mending, even just to sit on the boarding house porch with Ella. He didn't make a show of it, but his presence was deliberate, a clear message to anyone watching that Eleanor was under his protection. Thomas, for his part, kept his distance, but Eleanor saw him twice that first day, once outside the hotel, watching her with cold eyes as she walked past, and again that evening, standing across the street from the boarding house, just visible in the lamplight, smoking a cigarette and staring up at her window. She pulled the curtains closed with shaking hands. That night, Caleb didn't even pretend he was going to sleep in the chair. He pulled it over to block the door, sat down with his rifle across his lap, and settled in like he was standing guard. Eleanor lay in bed listening to the sounds of the town settling into sleep, and wondered how long they could live like this, waiting for Thomas to make his move, always looking over their shoulders, never fully free. The answer came 3 days later. Eleanor was doing laundry in the yard behind the boarding house, Ella asleep in a basket nearby, when she heard footsteps on the path. She looked up, expecting to see Mrs. Fletcher or one of the other women who helped with the washing. Instead, she found Thomas. He stood at the edge of the yard, hands in his pockets, his expression deceptively mild, but Eleanor saw the tension in his shoulders, the way his eyes lingered on Ella with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Hello, Eleanor," he said pleasantly. Eleanor straightened slowly, putting herself between Thomas and the basket. "The judge ordered you to stay away from me." "The judge isn't here," Thomas said, echoing Caleb's words from days before. "And I'm not doing anything wrong, just talking to my wife." "I'm not your wife anymore." "So you keep saying." Thomas took a step closer, and Eleanor forced herself not to retreat. "But that's just a piece of paper, Eleanor. It doesn't change what's true. You're mine. That baby is mine. And this little performance you're putting on with your cowboy husband." His smile was cruel. "It's embarrassing." "Get out," Eleanor said, her voice shaking but firm. "I'll leave when I'm ready." Thomas's gaze drifted to Ella again. She looks like me, don't you think? Same chin, same eyes. Anyone with sense can see she's a haze. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. If you touch her— I don't need to touch her, Thomas interrupted smoothly. I just need to establish paternity, get a judge who's more sympathetic to a father's rights. There are ways around what happened in that courtroom, Eleanor. Legal ways. And I have money and connections and patience. He smiled. How long do you think your drifter will stick around when he realizes what he's gotten himself into? When the lawyers start circling and the bills start piling up and people start asking questions about why he's so eager to claim another man's child? Caleb isn't like you, Eleanor said fiercely. Everyone's like me when it comes down to it, Thomas said. Everyone looks out for themselves, you'll see. He tipped his hat mockingly. Give my daughter a kiss for me. He turned and walked away, unhurried and confident, leaving Eleanor standing frozen in the yard, her chest heaving with rage and terror. She didn't move until she heard the gate click shut. Then she snatched up Ella's basket and ran. She found Caleb at the livery, repairing a broken wagon wheel. He looked up as she burst through the door, took one look at her face, and set down his tools. What happened? Eleanor told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. Caleb's expression grew darker with every sentence, but he didn't interrupt. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. He threatened you, Caleb said finally. He threatened to take Ella. Same thing. Caleb's hands clenched into fists. I should have. There's nothing you could have done, Eleanor said. He made sure no one else was around. It would be his word against mine. Then we make sure he doesn't get another chance, Caleb said grimly. He looked at Hank, who'd been listening from the back of the stable. Can you send word to the marshal in Omaha? Tell him we need someone here to enforce the judge's order? I can try, Hank said doubtfully, but the marshal's got jurisdiction over a 100-mile radius. Could be weeks before he can spare a deputy. Then we don't wait for the law, Caleb said. We handle this ourselves. Eleanor's stomach twisted. Caleb, no. If you confront him, if you do anything that looks like what? Protecting my wife? Caleb's gaze was steady, unyielding. That's what I am, Eleanor. Your husband, and I'm not going to stand by while he terrorizes you. And I'm not going to let you do something that gets you arrested or killed, Eleanor shot back. Thomas wants you to lose your temper. He wants you to give him an excuse to claim you're dangerous, that I'm not safe with you. Don't give him that. Caleb stared at her, frustration and helplessness warring in his expression. Finally, he nodded once, sharply. All right, we do it your way. But he comes near you again, all bets are off. That night, Caleb didn't sleep at all. Eleanor woke several times to find him sitting motionless in the chair, watching the door, the rifle always within reach. The lamp burned low, casting his shadow large against the wall, and Eleanor thought about how strange it was that 3 months ago this man had been a stranger, and now he was the only thing standing between her and the darkness that wanted to swallow her whole. The next morning brought a bitter cold, the kind that sank into your bones and wouldn't let go. Eleanor bundled Ella against her chest and ventured out only as far as the general store, Caleb a silent presence at her side. People greeted them warily, and Eleanor could feel the weight of their speculation, wondering how long this makeshift family could hold together, whether the violence simmering beneath the surface would eventually boil over. She was measuring out flour when the door opened and a woman she didn't recognize walked in. She was younger than Eleanor, maybe 25, dressed in expensive traveling clothes with her hair pinned in the latest fashion. She looked around the store with the entitled ease of someone used to being catered to. Then her gaze landed on Eleanor, and her eyes widened. "You're Eleanor Hayes," she said. It wasn't a question. Eleanor's hand stilled. "I'm Eleanor Ross now." The woman's lip curled. "So it's true. You actually married some drifter to steal my brother's child." Eleanor's blood ran cold. "You're Thomas's sister." "Charlotte Hayes Brennan," the woman said crisply. "I came as soon as Thomas sent word about what you'd done, annulling your marriage, taking up with another man, turning my niece against her own father." "That's not what happened," Eleanor said, her voice shaking. "Isn't it?" Charlotte took a step closer, her voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "Thomas told me everything. How you got lost because you weren't paying attention. How you blamed him for your own stupidity. How you seduced some cowboy into marrying you just to hurt my brother. Eleanor felt like she'd been slapped. That's a lie. Is it? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you traded one husband for another awfully fast. Charlotte's gaze raked over Eleanor with open contempt. My brother deserves better than you, and that baby deserves a father who can actually provide for her, not some vagrant who'll be gone the minute things get difficult. Caleb is more of a father to Ella than Thomas ever was, Eleanor said, her voice rising despite her efforts to stay calm. You've known him for what, 3 months? And you think that means something? Charlotte laughed harshly. You're pathetic. And when this falls apart, and it will, Thomas will be there to pick up the pieces. Of his daughter, anyway. You can rot for all he cares. She turned on her heel and swept out of the store, leaving Eleanor standing frozen among the sacks of flour and grain, her face burning with humiliation and rage. Caleb appeared at her elbow, having witnessed the entire exchange from where he'd been examining harnesses near the door. Who was that? Thomas's sister, Eleanor said numbly. She came to, I don't know, intimidate me, defend him. Caleb's jaw tightened. She succeeded? Eleanor looked up at him, this man who'd given her everything and asked for so little in return. No, she said quietly. She just made me angry. Something that might have been approval flickered in Caleb's eyes. Good. Angry's better than scared. They finished their shopping in silence and walked back to the boarding house through the biting cold. Eleanor's mind churned with Charlotte's words, with the realization that Thomas wasn't just fighting alone anymore. He had family backing him, money, resources, and a narrative that painted Eleanor as the villain and himself as the wronged party. And the terrifying part was that some people would believe it. Were already believing it. That evening, Pastor Dalton came by with news that made everything worse. Thomas Hayes has filed a custody petition, he said grimly, standing in the boarding house parlor with his hat in his hands. Charlotte Brennan is funding it. They've hired lawyers from Omaha and are demanding a new hearing to determine parental rights. Eleanor felt the floor tilt beneath her. But the judge already ruled. He gave me sole custody. Judge Brennan ruled on the annulment and the immediate custody question, Pastor Dalton explained. But Thomas is arguing that the ruling was premature, that he wasn't given adequate opportunity to defend himself, and that the court should reconsider now that emotions have cooled. That's insane, Caleb said flatly. He abandoned them. The evidence was clear. The law doesn't always care about clear evidence when there's money involved, Pastor Dalton said wearily. And Thomas has the resources to keep this tied up in court for months, maybe years. Eleanor sank into a chair. Ella clutched against her chest. He's going to take her from me. Not if we fight back, Caleb said immediately. We'll get our own lawyer. With what money? Eleanor asked, her voice breaking. We can barely afford rent and food. How are we supposed to pay for lawyers? The question hung unanswered in the cold room. Pastor Dalton cleared his throat. There might be another way. I've been in contact with a legal aid organization in Omaha that helps women in difficult situations. They work on contingency and donations. If I vouch for your case, do it, Caleb said immediately. Whatever it takes. Pastor Dalton nodded. I'll send a telegram tomorrow. But Eleanor, he looked at her with deep sympathy. This is going to get ugly. Thomas will drag your name through the mud, question your character, make this as painful as possible. Are you prepared for that? Eleanor thought about the prairie, about the moment she'd collapsed in the grass, knowing she was going to die. She thought about waking up in the doctor's office, about the kindness of strangers, about standing in front of Judge Brennan and claiming her right to exist as something other than Thomas Hayes's property. She looked at Caleb, at this man who'd become her husband and her shield, who stood beside her even when it would have been easier to walk away. Then she looked down at Ella, her daughter, her reason for surviving. Yes, Eleanor said, her voice steady and sure. I'm prepared. Because she'd already lost everything once. She'd already been left to die. She'd already clawed her way back from the edge of oblivion. Whatever Thomas Hayes threw at her now, she would survive it. She had to. For Ella. For Caleb. For herself. And if surviving meant fighting, then she would fight with everything she had until there was nothing left to take. The lawyer from the legal aid organization arrived 6 days later on the afternoon stage, a woman named Margaret Chen, who carried a leather satchel and wore her conviction like armor. She was barely 30, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that reminded Eleanor of the school teachers she'd admired as a child, the ones who didn't back down from bullies, no matter how big they were. Margaret sat up in the church office and spent 3 hours interviewing Eleanor, taking notes in precise handwriting, asking questions that cut to the bone. She didn't shy away from the hard parts, didn't soften her language when she asked about the abandonment, about Thomas's violence, about the terror of lying in the grass waiting to die. "I need the truth," Margaret said bluntly, "all of it. Because Thomas's lawyers will twist everything they can, and I need to know what's coming." So Eleanor told her. Everything. The years of marriage that had slowly eroded her sense of self. The way Thomas's anger had grown sharper after Ella was born. How he'd started to see them both as burdens instead of family. The morning he'd ridden away without looking back. The hours of walking until her legs gave out. The moment she'd known they weren't going to survive. Margaret wrote it all down, her expression unchanging. When Eleanor finished, the lawyer set down her pen and looked her straight in the eye. "You're going to win this," she said with absolute certainty. "Not because the law is on your side, though it is, but because you're willing to fight. And that matters more than you know." Eleanor wanted to believe her, but that night, as she lay in bed listening to Caleb's steady breathing from the chair by the door, doubt crept in like cold through a cracked window. Thomas had money, influence, a sister who'd stand beside him and swear to anything. What did Eleanor have? A husband of 3 weeks? A town full of people who'd helped her out of pity, and a lawyer working for free. It didn't feel like enough. The custody hearing was scheduled for 2 weeks later, giving Thomas's lawyers plenty of time to prepare their assault. An assault it was. Over those 2 weeks, Eleanor watched as carefully constructed lies spread through Ridgefield like poison in a well. Charlotte Hayes Brennan made sure of it. She took a room at the hotel and made herself a fixture in town, presenting herself as the concerned aunt, the voice of reason. She spoke to anyone who would listen about poor Thomas, who'd made a mistake in the heat of the moment, but had come back to make amends, only to find his wife had already replaced him. She hinted at impropriety between Eleanor and Caleb, suggesting they'd known each other before the abandonment, that perhaps Eleanor had orchestrated the whole thing to escape a marriage she regretted. The whispers started small but grew louder. Eleanor felt them every time she walked through town, the sidelong glances, the conversations that stopped when she approached, the way some of the women who'd brought her food and baby clothes now crossed the street to avoid her. It hurt more than she'd expected. These people had seen her at her lowest. They knew what Thomas had done. But doubt, once planted, grew fast. Caleb saw it happening, and it made him quietly furious. "They're cowards," he said one evening, pacing the small room like a caged animal. "They know the truth, and they're letting her poison them against you anyway." "Fear makes people stupid," Eleanor said wearily. She was mending one of Caleb's shirts, her fingers working automatically while Ella slept nearby. "Charlotte's rich and connected. I'm nobody. They're hedging their bets." "You're not nobody," Caleb said fiercely. "You're—" He stopped, seemed to struggle for words. "You're stronger than any of them. You survived what would have killed most people. You stood up in court and told the truth knowing it would cost you. That's not nobody." Eleanor's hands stilled. She looked up at him, this man who'd given her his name and his protection, who stood guard over her sleep every night, who'd learned to hold Ella with the careful tenderness of someone who'd never expected to be trusted with something so precious. "Why do you care so much?" she asked quietly. "Really, not the version you tell yourself about doing the right thing. Why does this matter to you?" Caleb stopped pacing. For a long moment he just stood there, silhouetted against the lamplight, his expression hidden in shadow. "Because I know what it's like to be thrown away," he said finally. "After the war, I came home and nobody knew what to do with me. I wasn't the same person who'd left, and they didn't want to know the person I'd become. So I left. Figured it was easier to be nobody to strangers than nobody to people who used to love you." He looked at her directly. "When I found you in that grass, I saw someone else who'd been discarded, left behind because you weren't convenient anymore, and I thought—" His voice roughened. "I thought not this time. Not if I can help it." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Caleb, I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. I know this marriage is just paper. I know you didn't choose it, not really. But I need you to know that I did. Choose it, I mean, and I'll keep choosing it every day until you don't need me to anymore. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning Eleanor didn't know how to name. She wanted to tell him that she had chosen it too, in her own way. That what had started as desperate necessity had become something else. Something she didn't have words for yet, but felt in the way her breath came easier when he was near, in the way Ella reached for him with the same trust she showed her mother, in the way the room felt empty on the rare occasions he was gone. But before she could find the words, a sharp knock sounded at the door. Caleb's hand went to the rifle instantly. Who is it? Hank, you need to come quick. Caleb opened the door to find Hank pale and breathing hard. Thomas and 3 men are at the saloon. They're drinking heavy and talking about coming here, about settling things their own way. Eleanor's blood went cold. How many men? 4 total. Thomas, his sister's husband, and 2 hired guns from Omaha. Hank looked at Caleb grimly. They're armed, and they're not being subtle about it. Caleb's jaw set. Get Eleanor and Ella to the church. Pastor Dalton will keep them safe. No, Eleanor said immediately. I'm not leaving you to face them alone. You're not staying here where they can get to you, Caleb shot back. That's exactly what they want, to corner you, scare you, maybe worse. So we'll both go to the church, Eleanor argued, and they'll follow. Then we've got violence on church ground with you and Ella in the middle of it. Caleb shook his head. I'll meet them at the saloon. Public place, witnesses. They try anything stupid, the whole town will see it. Or they'll shoot you and claim self-defense, Eleanor said desperately. Caleb looked at her, and something in his expression gentled. I've faced worse odds than 4 drunk men. I'll be all right. You don't know that. No, he admitted. But I know I can't let them come here. And I know you and Ella need to be somewhere safe while I handle this. He turned to Hank. Get them to the church. Stay with them. Don't let anyone in except people you trust. Hank nodded. What about you? I'm going to end this, Caleb said quietly. Eleanor grabbed his arm. Please, there has to be another way. Caleb covered her hand with his touch warm and steady. There isn't, not anymore. Thomas isn't going to stop. He's going to keep pushing until someone breaks, and it's not going to be you. He leaned down so they were eye level. Trust me. Please. Eleanor wanted to argue, to find some solution that didn't involve Caleb walking into danger, but she saw the determination in his face and knew nothing she said would change his mind. Come back, she whispered. I will, he promised. 5 minutes later, Eleanor stood in the church with Ella in her arms, watching through a window as Caleb walked down the dark street toward the saloon. Margaret Chen had appeared from somewhere, summoned by Hank, and now stood beside Eleanor with the same grim expression she'd worn during their first meeting. That man loves you, Margaret said matter-of-factly. Eleanor's breath caught. He's never said, he doesn't have to. I've seen enough marriages to know what they look like when they're real. Margaret glanced at her. The question is whether you love him back. Eleanor watched Caleb's silhouette disappear into the saloon and felt her heart constrict with a fear that had nothing to do with custody hearings or legal battles. Yes, she said quietly. I think I do. Inside the saloon, Caleb found Thomas exactly where Hank said he'd be, holding court at a corner table with 3 men who had the hard, empty eyes of people who hurt others for money. The room fell silent as Caleb walked in, conversations dying mid-sentence. Thomas looked up with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Well, if it isn't my wife's new husband. Come to join us for a drink? I came to tell you to leave town, Caleb said evenly. Tonight. Thomas laughed. I don't think so. I've got business here, legal business. Or are you planning to stop me? If I have to. One of the hired men stood up, his hand drifting toward his gun. That sounds like a threat. It's a promise, Caleb said, not taking his eyes off Thomas. You want to drag this out in court, fine. We'll beat you there too. But if you come near Eleanor or Ella again, if you try to intimidate them or threaten them, I'll make sure you regret it. Thomas's smile vanished. You think you scare me? You're a drifter with no money and no prospects playing house with my family. You're nothing. Maybe, Caleb agreed. but I'm the nothing standing between you and them, and I'm not moving. The tension in the room stretched taut as wire. The bartender slowly backed toward the door. The few other patrons found urgent reasons to leave. Thomas stood, his chair scraping loud against the floor. You want to make this about violence? Fine. But you're outnumbered, and when this is over, I'll make sure everyone knows you started it. That you're dangerous. Unfit to be around my daughter. She's not your daughter anymore, Caleb said quietly. You gave up that right when you left her to die. Thomas's face went red. He nodded to the hired men, and they spread out, flanking Caleb from different sides. The one who'd stood earlier drew his gun. And then Sheriff Wade walked in. He was a grizzled man in his 60s who'd been sheriff for 20 years and had the kind of presence that could silence a room without saying a word. He looked at the drawn gun, at Thomas, at Caleb standing alone in the center of the saloon. Someone want to tell me what's going on? Wade asked mildly. No one spoke for a moment. Then Thomas found his voice. This man threatened me, Sheriff. I was simply defending myself. That so? Wade looked at Caleb. You threatened Mr. Hayes? I told him to leave Eleanor Ross alone, Caleb said, as ordered by Judge Brennan's ruling. Wade nodded slowly. And you gentlemen, he gestured to the hired guns. You got business in Ridgefield, or are you just here to look menacing? We're employed by Mr. Hayes, one of them said. To do what, exactly? Silence. Wade sighed. Here's how this is going to work. Mr. Hayes, you've got a custody hearing scheduled. Until then, you stay away from Mrs. Ross and her family. He pointed to the hired guns, put that weapon away before I arrest you for brandishing. And he looked at Caleb, go home to your wife. Sheriff, this man, Thomas started. I don't care, Wade interrupted. I've heard the stories. I know what happened out on that prairie. I know Judge Brennan's ruling, and I know you're here stirring up trouble when you should be leaving well enough alone. He stepped closer to Thomas. I also know your sister's been spreading rumors, and your lawyers have been making threats. Well, I'm telling you now, this is my town, and I won't have it torn apart by your pride. You want justice, you get it in the courtroom. You want revenge, you get the hell out of Dakota Territory. Thomas's jaw worked. I have rights, and so does Mrs. Ross. Now everyone get out of my saloon before I find reasons to lock you all up. The hired guns exchanged glances, then holstered their weapons and filed out. Thomas followed, shooting one last venomous look at Caleb. His brother-in-law trailed behind, looking uncomfortable. When they were gone, Wade turned to Caleb. That was stupid, coming here alone. Had to be done, Caleb said. Maybe. But next time someone wants to shoot you, try to make sure there are fewer witnesses. Wade's expression softened slightly. Your wife's at the church, probably scared out of her mind. Go tell her you're alive. Caleb nodded and headed for the door. As he stepped out into the cold night, he heard Wade mutter, Damn fools, all of them. Eleanor met him at the church door, her face white in the lamplight. She didn't say anything, just threw her arms around him. Ella squashed between them and held on like she was afraid he'd disappear. I'm all right, Caleb said quietly, his arms coming up to hold them both. Sheriff Wade stopped it before it started. Eleanor pulled back just enough to look at his face, checking for injuries, for blood, for any sign that he was lying. Finding none, she sagged against him. I thought... She couldn't finish the sentence. I know, Caleb said. I'm sorry. They stood there in the church doorway, holding each other in the cold dark. And Eleanor realized that somewhere along the way, this arrangement of convenience had become something else entirely, something that felt an awful lot like home. The custody hearing 2 weeks later was brutal. Thomas's lawyers came armed with character witnesses who swore to his good nature, financial records that proved he could provide for a child, and carefully constructed arguments about a father's natural rights. They painted Eleanor as unstable, impulsive, prone to poor judgment. They suggested her marriage to Caleb was evidence of moral weakness, that she'd taken up with the first man who showed her attention. Charlotte testified with tears in her eyes about her dear brother who'd made one terrible mistake and had been trying to atone ever since. She spoke eloquently about family bonds, about a child's need for her father, about the shame Eleanor had brought on the Hayes name. It was a masterful performance, and Eleanor watched several people in the courtroom nodding along. Then Margaret Chen stood up and systematically destroyed every argument they'd made. She called the doctor, who testified again to the severity of Eleanor and Ella's conditions, to the fact that without immediate intervention, they would have died. She called Hank, who described finding Eleanor unconscious with Ella barely breathing. She called Mrs. Fletcher, who spoke about Eleanor's terror and trauma, the way she still flinched at sudden movements, the nightmares that woke her crying. And then Margaret called Caleb. He sat in the witness chair looking uncomfortable in his clean shirt and borrowed jacket, his hat in his hands, and told the truth in simple, unvarnished language. He described finding them in the grass, riding through the heat with Eleanor dying in his arms. The decision to stay because leaving would have meant abandoning them to Thomas's mercy. "Why did you marry Mrs. Ross?" Margaret asked. "Because Thomas Hayes came back and tried to take her by force," Caleb said. "Because the law wouldn't protect her unless she had a husband. Because it was the only way I could keep her and Ella safe." "Do you love her?" The question hung in the silent courtroom. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. "Yes," he said simply. "I do." Eleanor's breath stopped. They'd never spoken those words to each other, never acknowledged what was growing between them in the quiet moments when Ella slept and they sat together in lamplight, talking about everything and nothing. But Caleb said it now, under oath, in front of everyone. "And do you consider yourself Ella's father?" Margaret asked. "I'm the only father she's ever known," Caleb said. "I'm the one who walks her when she cries at night. I'm the one who'll teach her to ride a horse and read a book and stand up for herself when the world tries to knock her down." He looked at Thomas. "Blood doesn't make a father. Being there does." The courtroom erupted in whispers. The judge banged his gavel for silence. Thomas's lawyers tried to recover, but the damage was done. They called Thomas to the stand, and Margaret eviscerated him with questions that exposed every lie, every inconsistency, every moment of calculated cruelty. "You maintain you intended to send help back for your wife and child?" Margaret asked. "Yes, Thomas said stiffly. "Yet you waited 2 weeks to contact the authorities. Why?" I needed to get my bearings, assess the situation. You needed to see if they'd died so you wouldn't have to deal with them anymore," Margaret said bluntly. "Objection!" Thomas's lawyer shouted. "Sustained," the judge said. But the point had been made. The hearing lasted 6 hours. When it was over, the judge took less than 10 minutes to deliberate. "I've reviewed all the testimony and evidence," he said, "and I find that Thomas Hayes willfully and deliberately abandoned his wife and infant daughter in circumstances that would have resulted in their deaths. His subsequent actions demonstrate a pattern of intimidation and harassment designed to regain control, not to reunite with his family." He looked at Thomas with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Hayes, your parental rights are hereby terminated. You have no claim to Ella Ross, no right to contact or visitation, and if you come within 100 yards of Mrs. Ross or her family, you will be arrested." He turned to Eleanor and Caleb. "Mr. and Mrs. Ross, the child is legally yours. I wish you all the best." The gavel came down with a finality that echoed through Eleanor's chest like a bell. It was over. Really over. Thomas stood frozen, his face ashen. Charlotte let out a cry of outrage. The lawyers gathered their papers in tight-lipped silence, and Eleanor felt Caleb's hand find hers, their fingers lacing together as they stood up together, a family in the eyes of the law and in every way that mattered. They walked out of the courtroom into the cold afternoon to find half of Ridgefield waiting. The people who'd doubted, who'd whispered, who'd let fear make them stupid. They were there now, and the shame on their faces was almost worse than the betrayal had been. Mrs. Fletcher stepped forward first. "I'm sorry," she said simply. "We should have stood by you stronger." Others echoed the sentiment, offering congratulations and apologies in equal measure. Eleanor accepted them with grace she didn't entirely feel, but Caleb's presence beside her made it bearable. They walked back to the boarding house through the gathering dusk, Ella asleep in Eleanor's arms, and neither of them spoke until they were alone in their room. "You told them you loved me," Eleanor said quietly. Caleb set his hat on the bureau. I did. Did you mean it? He turned to look at her, and the vulnerability in his expression stole her breath. Yes. Eleanor set Ella carefully in her cradle, then crossed the room to stand in front of him. I love you too, she said. I don't know when it happened. Maybe when you carried us through the heat. Maybe when you stood between me and Thomas. Maybe when you learned to hold Ella like she was made of glass. She reached up to touch his face. But it happened. And I need you to know that this marriage, it's not just paper to me, not anymore. Caleb's hand came up to cover hers. What is it then? Real, Eleanor said simply. The realest thing I've ever had. He kissed her then, soft and careful, like he was afraid she might break. And Eleanor kissed him back, pouring everything she couldn't say into the press of lips and the tangle of breath. Gratitude and trust and the fragile, fierce hope that maybe, after everything, they'd found something worth keeping. When they pulled apart, Caleb rested his forehead against hers. So what now? Eleanor smiled. Now we figure out how to be a family, for real this time. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in front of a small building at the edge of Ridgefield with a hand-painted sign that read, Ross School. The town had voted to fund a proper schoolhouse, and Eleanor had been hired as the teacher, not in spite of her past, but because of it. Because she'd proven herself to be exactly the kind of person they wanted teaching their children, someone who knew how to survive, how to fight, how to choose hope, when despair would have been easier. Caleb had taken a position as deputy sheriff, working alongside Wade to keep the peace. It was steady work with decent pay, and it meant they could afford the small house they'd rented on the edge of town. 2 rooms and a loft, nothing fancy, but theirs. Ella was nearly a year old now, taking her first wobbling steps and babbling sounds that would soon be words. She called Caleb Papa with the same easy confidence she called Eleanor Mama, and watching them together still made Eleanor's chest tight with emotion she didn't have names for. Thomas Hayes had disappeared after the hearing, last seen boarding a train east. Charlotte had followed him, taking her poison and her money and her righteous indignation somewhere else. They left behind nothing but bad memories and the satisfaction of knowing Eleanor had won. Not just in court, in every way that mattered. She'd survived the impossible, built a life from the ashes, found love in the last place she'd expected, and created a family that wasn't bound by blood or obligation, but by choice and commitment and the daily decision to show up for each other, no matter what. As Eleanor turned to go inside, she felt Caleb's arms wrap around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder. Ready for your first day? He asked. Ready, Eleanor said. But she wasn't thinking about the school or the students who would arrive in an hour or the lessons she'd prepared. She was thinking about the morning 3 months ago when she'd woken sick and realized she was pregnant, about the joy on Caleb's face when she'd told him, the way he'd held her like she was precious, about the future they were building together, one choice at a time. She turned in his arms to kiss him properly, there in the doorway of her school, in the town that had become home, under the wide Dakota sky that had once nearly killed her but now felt full of possibility. I love you, she said against his lips. I love you too, Caleb replied. And Eleanor knew, with the bone-deep certainty of someone who'd walked through fire and come out whole, that this was what she'd been fighting for all along. Not just survival, not just safety, but this, a life built on her own terms, with a man who'd chosen her every day since the moment he'd heard a baby cry in the grass. A family born not from blood, but from courage, conviction, and the simple, profound act of refusing to give up. She'd started this journey abandoned and dying in the prairie, with nothing but her daughter and a will to survive. She was ending it with a husband who loved her, a child who thrived, another baby on the way, and a future that stretched as wide and promising as the horizon. And that, Eleanor thought as she took Caleb's hand and walked into her school, was more than victory. It was home.